here in Deuteronomy 30. Of course, this is kind of closer to the end of Moses' life. He has already produced Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and now we're finishing up Deuteronomy. And Moses informs all the people about the blessings and cursings and the law that they've been given. And this is sort of how Moses wraps up his sermon. Starting in verse 11 of Deuteronomy 30, Moses says, "For this commandment which I command you today is not too far mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, 'Who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it?' Nor is it beyond the sea that you say, 'Who will go over to the sea for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it?' But the word is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may do it." Let me just stop right there. What Moses is making the point simply is you now have the written word, which was something new for these people. If these people lived under a patriarchal system before this, there was a dependence on the fathers or some type of prophets or even kings to come and inform you what the will of God was through visions and dreams. But at this moment, this was revolutionary. Moses has written a book. And I would imagine that that book was copied and given to different Levites, and it would have been those Levites' jobs within those different cities to communicate that book, that you could go to a Levite and they would read it to you or tell you what it says. And this was revolutionary. So Moses makes to the point to the people. He says, you don't need someone to ascend into heaven and come back and say, okay, I talked to God. I know what he wants now. Here, let me tell you to do it. He says, you don't need someone to go across the sea and go talk to God and then come back and say, okay, I know what God wants to do. Here, this is what God said. He said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. Now it is near you. And he says it's near you, and because it's near you, you can put it in your heart and you can put it in your mouth. And this is a powerful message. Now, what's important usually when we read this is we take it to Ephesians 4, where Jesus ascended into heaven, didn't he? And Paul makes the point that because Jesus ascended into heaven, he has basically the authority to change the law. That he went to heaven and he talked to God and he knows what God wants us to do now. And so even now, in a Christian sense, since Jesus has already ascended into heaven and we know that he has communicated to what God wants us to do, we can say the same thing. Well, we don't need anyone to ascend into heaven. Jesus has already done it. We know what the will of God is. It is near us, the written word. And here in Deuteronomy 30, the written word was a new thing. And it was an exciting thing, wasn't it? What I like to spend some time with you talking about tonight is actually the Dead Sea Scrolls. Back in March, I originally planned to talk about this, and it's because some of the Dead Sea Scrolls were on the news that they were deemed to be fake. And that's why I thought, hey, this might be a good time to talk about this. Uh, this isn't usually something normal that we do. We're not going to be able to read a lot of passages, but we get to consider the text as a whole and try to understand what these things are. We'll be talking about what are they, what they do, and why are we still talking about them, and why they be significant to Christians like you and me. What's interesting is these past couple of months, I've been talking to brethren and other people, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? And very much like me, nobody has an earthly idea actually what they are. You hear people say that they're the New Testament. One person told me that Jesus wrote them and put them there. Like it's just all over the place, right? It's because it's usually something that we don't talk about, but we do reference a lot. I remember being a little kid in a Bible class. We were talking about something in the Bible, and somebody said, well, yeah, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we all nodded in agreement. Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls. I had no idea what the Dead Sea Scrolls were. I was just nodding my head, going along with everybody else. And I imagine maybe there's some here that do the same thing. But maybe we could correct that tonight. And I think what we can see is something very interesting about the way God preserved his word. And so that's what we'll be talking about tonight. And I think this will be exciting. We get to look at some pictures and talk about some exciting things that we've done in our history. This is what happened in March. The Museum of the Bible, I think it's owned by Hobby Lobby. They had some Dead Sea Scrolls, and in March, they were deemed as forgeries. And so it was back in the news and got me thinking about it again. And these were forgeries. Somebody had gotten an old piece of paper, and they had written some Hebrew on it, and they sold it to these people as if they were Dead Sea Scrolls, but they weren't. And so there's a reason, though, why these things were circulating in the U.S. Let me start at the very beginning. 1947 was the year that the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And there in my picture there, that's where they were discovered. They were discovered in Qumran, which is an ancient village right beside the Dead Sea. And the story is, and you've probably heard the story, that there was these shepherd boys found the scrolls by throwing rocks in caves in Qumran. And usually the story goes something like there was a sheep wandering off and they threw a rock to get him to come back and it went into a cave and the rock smashed a pot. So they investigated and there was these Dead Sea Scrolls. This story probably isn't true. It seems like more likely it was treasure hunters that were looking for treasure and they found treasure. And that's what happened. But regardless of how they were discovered and they were sold to an antiques dealer in Israel. And that antiques dealer turned around and he sold it to Americans. And so the story is that now they're in the U.S. and they're being transported around. Just a few of them are. And by 1949 is when journalists began to figure out what was going on. And maybe you saw articles like this in 49 talking about these Bible scrolls that were going around the U.S. And people called them hoax. They weren't real. They'd have no idea where they came from. But people were talking about them. And so eventually by 49, people started discovering what these things were. Well, after 49, the Jordan Department of Antiquities returned to the caves to actually look for it. It got enough momentum, enough talk about it, and the Jordan government, and that's the country that's neighboring to Israel, decided to investigate. And in 51, they go in and they start pulling these pots full of scrolls out of the caves. There were some things going on. The reason why it didn't get published very fast, the Jordan, which is mostly a Muslim country, was worried about what was inside and more concerned about their own religion. They made some rules like only Muslims could go and research these scrolls. That's a problem because all the documents were written in ancient Hebrew. So who would probably be the most qualified to figure out what the scrolls are? Well, probably Jews today would be the people that would know ancient Hebrew the best. So things slowed down, didn't really move anywhere, but they were collecting the scrolls. In 1954, the Dead Sea Scrolls were being sold in the classifieds in the USA. And so while the Jordanians are picking them up out of the cave, the ones that were first found are still circulating in the US, and somebody makes a classifieds for them in the Wall Street Journal. If you can't see this, I'll read it to you. It says the 4 Dead Sea Scrolls. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or a group. So if you go back in a time machine, maybe you can make some money if you purchased them off the classifieds in the Wall Street Journal. We go on in 54, the new Israeli government is created. If you remember, President Truman's the first person that he says, okay, I'm going to accept that this Israeli government truly is a government. And the Israeli government begins purchasing these Dead Sea Scrolls and acquiring them from the Jordanian government. And so this is a moment now where, hold on, maybe these things will actually get published and the news will be spread about them. In 1957 was finally when the story really broke loose. The story comes out that the Dead Sea Scrolls have been discovered, and this is what's significant, and this is why we're talking about it. And they contained Old Testament texts about 1,000 years older than our current copies or our current manuscripts. And Time Magazine did this big thing about it, and people began talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls in 57. And by now, we're still collecting them, and we're still trying to research them, and they're still trying to publish them, even all the way back since 57. What are they? They are about 900 different documents that was found in about 11 different caves. And I think this is important that we're very clear about this. They were written around 150 BC to 50 AD. And some people extend that past, a little past 50 AD. Some people extend the past back further into the Greece period. But what we have here basically for sure is documents that were written before the birth of Jesus. And according to the Bible's history, we don't have any copies that old of anything. That's a very big deal that we found something this old. As we're looking at these things, only a portion of them are actually Old Testament books. And let's be clear about this as well. There are no New Testament books in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sometimes you'll hear Christians say something about the New Testament in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are no New Testament books in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The people who put them there were not Christians. And that's because Christianity didn't exist yet. That's how old these things are. A portion of the manuscripts are Old Testament books, but also another large portion is not Old Testament books. You've got a lot of documents concerning things like community rules. There's this famous scroll about the temple scroll, about things going on in the temple. There's the Essene rule of conduct. That was a sect that lived around the time of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There's all these different things in there, and a portion of them is Old Testament books. But of course, the Old Testament books is what we're focused on the most. Some of them are in very good condition. If you've seen pictures of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they'll show you this picture, which is the Isaiah manuscript. And the Isaiah manuscript is in very good condition, and almost the whole book is still together intact. Most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, though, are shredded. They look more like this. So since 57, the Israeli government has hired people to play a jigsaw puzzle game. The problem with this jigsaw puzzle game is that, number one, these things are written in ancient Hebrew. You got to know ancient Hebrew to be able to put them together. But not only that, but there's over 50,000 fragments. So you can understand since 57, they have been playing this jigsaw puzzle game, trying to tape these things together and trying to publish them. So even today, even right now, they are still working on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not only that, but last year they actually found some more scrolls. So it's a continuing process, and even more is being revealed over and over again. So far, they have found every single Old Testament book except for Esther. So almost every single Old Testament book is represented somehow, either in a fragment or in a full scroll. So why are we talking about them? Because, all of that so far, it's good at least just to know, and maybe it's something you could talk about when you go out to eat. But what's the point of talking about it in a sermon? This is why we're talking about these things. These are Old Testament books that are more than 2,000 years old. What's significant about that is that before they were discovered, our manuscripts are only 1,000 years old. These things are 1,000 years older than what we have. If you use the New King James or the Old King James, you're looking at the Masoretic text when you read the Old Testament. So the King James usually uses the Deceptus Receptus for the New Testament. But when you're reading the Old Testament, is using the Masoretic text, which is written from around between 900 to 1000 AD. It's a Middle Ages text that we have. And when they were making the King James in the 1600s, they pulled that one out and said, this is a good established Old Testament. Let's use this to make these Bibles. And it's still used today. Another one would be the Septuagint, right? There's a copy of the Masoretic text there. We're only using those, and then all of a sudden in 47, we have access to manuscripts that are 1,000 years older than that. And that's a big deal. When that happens, when these scrolls are found, especially in the 50s, there were some, and even Christians, were fearful about what the Old Testament Dead Sea Scrolls were going to say. Why were they afraid? They were afraid that it would be different than what we have in our laps. Because if they were different, and there were some core differences in that Old Testament 2,000-year-old text than what we have in our laps, it means that the Old Testament has not been preserved. I heard preachers say before that remember the 50s, and they remember what was going on, and they remember Christians saying out of their mouths, well, when they find things, I guess we're just going to have to change our Bibles. We're just going to have to yield to whatever it says, whatever thing's new. Can you imagine living in a world where these scrolls were revealed, and for some reason these scrolls did not have the David and Goliath story, and that there were Christians talking about, whether we should remove the David and Goliath story because it's not in the Dead Sea Scrolls? That's kind of the world they were living in for just a second. And it was a scary time. As you know, things are going to get good, but this was a fearful thing of what these things were going to reveal. This is why we're talking about them. The Israelites and Christians, you and me, have been participating in a 3,500-year game of telephone. And maybe you remember playing telephone as a kid, and I've used this as an analogy before, but that you would pass on information to the last person and see if the thing remained accurate. If we were going to play telephone in this building, what I would do is I would whisper something in Mike's ear over here, and he would whisper it to the next person and whisper it to the next person. We go all the way around, I guess, until we get to Mr. Paul, and Mr. Paul would say out loud what it is. And it was always a fun game to play as a kid because it never was right. You would say something like, my cat hates baths or something like that. It would go all the way around and it would end with my dog is Polish. It'd be something like that, right? And, you did it as a kid and everybody laughed. We had a good old time and all that kind of sort of thing. Well, a lot of critics have used the game of telephone to be skeptical about the Bible. That the Bible is a game of telephone in a way, in a context. And that how can you believe that things are going to remain accurate in this very, very long game of telephone? And assuming Moses died in 1592, that would be about when we've been playing this with the Old Testament. 3,500 years is a long time to be passing down information. We've been passing down their writings trying to preserve the word of the Spirit, the work of the Spirit. This is just kind of to illustrate this. If Moses wrote his original book, like he originally wrote Deuteronomy, that book no longer exists. Paper or leather or whatever he wrote it on, that document would not exist that test of time. But what it could be is copied and copied and copied and copied and passed down to the point that we get 3,500 years later, we get to my Bible in my lap. And so I can't go back and look at Moses's work and see if things have been accurate. But what I try to do is I am trusting and depending that we have passed down this information correctly, and I have an accurate copy of the things that the Spirit actually told Moses. And that's what we're betting on and what we're planning on. Well, there's some things to say about this. If you get on the internet and you purposely look for skeptical responses about the Bible, most people are going to use that as an example. They're going to say, the Bible has been at this very long game of telephone. There's no way that it stayed accurate all over this time. That famous debate in 2014 that Ken Ham did with Bill Nye, which in my opinion was not very good. Maybe you're like me. I watched like 5 minutes of it. I'm like, all right, let's go to Netflix and find something else. But apparently Bill Nye used that as an argument to Ken Ham, as he said, you've been playing this game of telephone for 3,500 years. There's no way it can remain accurate. Well, a lot of people, and we can handle it this way. I think this is a justifiable way to handle that question, is to say, okay, but the Bible isn't really the game of telephone. It is a written copy, not an oral tradition. So if I come over here and I tell Mike something and we pass it all the way down just by voice, there's a good chance that Mr. Paul over here is going to say something different. But if I wrote something down and I told Mike to write it down and to pass it on and write that down, and we wrote it all down, there's now a very good chance that it's going to be correct by the time it gets to Mr. Paul. And it's because written tradition is very different than an oral tradition, a tradition that's given by mouth. And so when Moses comes along in Deuteronomy 30 and he says, you don't have to ask for someone to ascend on high anymore. No one has to come to you and bring you the word from God. No, you have it right here. This was something new that was going to get passed down. And there was a much better chance of that tradition being accurate and correct throughout the ages. It's very different than the game of telephone. And I think that's a good argument to use against that. It's very different than word of mouth. But with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can go somewhere different. And that's what I want to do. Here's my Bibles of copies throughout time. My red one here is what Moses wrote. And my blue one here is my Bible. And each one of my little books here represents 100 years of manuscripts, copies of the original. And I'm going down here. Here's number 1, here's number 2, here's number 3, and we keep on going over, right? And I'm working through 3,500 years of history to get to my copies of the Bible. My Old Testament, because I use New King James, comes from the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text would sit right there. I know for a fact that between the Masoretic text and my New King James, that they are the same thing. And the reason why is because I can go look at the Masoretic text, right? It still exists. I can examine it and go, okay, Between the Masoretic text 1,000 years ago and my Old Testament, they're the same things. Things remained accurate. Those were good copies. My problem is after the Masoretic text, and you can see my faded gray books, none of these exist anymore. And that's the way the world worked for a very long time. That we can go back to the Masoretic text, but there's no telling what came in here all the way to get back to Moses. Going back to my example, I'm sorry, Mike and Paul, for y'all getting brought up so much. At least it's in a good thing, right? It'd be terrible if it was a bad thing. If I gave Mike that information and I passed it down and all I got now was Mr. Paul's information, well, if I was in a situation where I wanted to know if Mike and Paul's things were accurate, there may be a possibility in a biblical context that I can't get back to the original source, Mike. So if I'm in Paul's situation, maybe my best chance, if I can't get to Mike, would be go to someone here in the middle and see at least from the middle if they were correct. Or at least try to get as close to Mike as possible and see if they were correct. If that middle person or that person close to Mike is also the same that what Mr. Paul has, well, then I would think, okay, well, I actually have a pretty good reason to believe that this information has stayed accurate as it's been passed down. That's the very thing the Dead Sea Scrolls provided for us. Because then all of a sudden in 1957, our Old Testament manuscript was here. We were able to go back in time and pluck a manuscript out of these things that didn't exist. That was a big deal. And then we've read the Dead Sea Scrolls, at least the ones that they've got put together. They've translated them. And we compare that to what we have in our lap. And they're practically the same thing. You know this passage. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was at the surface of the deep. And God's Spirit was hovering over the surface of the water. I didn't get that out of the New King James. That's Cave 4, Scroll 7 of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was the same thing. And when you have something like this, where you're able to pluck someone out of history like this and compare their Bible to our Bible, and they're the same thing, what does that say? Well, it says that our Old Testaments did not change. They were good. And guess what? They have always been good. Now, if the Dead Sea Scrolls were very different, we would have a problem, wouldn't we? But they weren't. There is a reason why when you talk to a skeptic or when you hear someone on the internet make a comment about the Bible, they don't reference the Dead Sea Scrolls. If they were different and the Dead Sea Scrolls were very different from the Old Testament, guys, it would be all we would hear about. But we don't. Nobody talks about it. And it's because it's powerful evidence and a great defense that our Old Testaments remain the same over the course of 2,000 years. That's very impressive. The Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, are much closer to Moses than the Masoretic text is. And this is pretty incredible. It's something very exciting. This is why we're talking about this. And this is why it's powerful evidence for the case that the Old Testament has remained the same and God has preserved his word. This is what I want us to take from all this, because that was just like one little message, but I think there's some things that we should make some application from a thought like this. Number one is that the Bible's and even the Old Testament's preservation is unnaturally accurate. There are no other ancient manuscripts or copies that have done what the Bible has done. As in, when we go look at the Iliad, or maybe when we go look at some of Plato's works, and we compare them to older manuscripts, they all have changed. They've been very different. And that's because what you have is in these stories and these writings, people have embellished them, people have changed them, or maybe accidentally changed them because they couldn't pass the story down right. But the Bible didn't do that at all, right? And it makes sense that these other manuscripts did this. That's what naturally should happen. Stories should change when they get passed from hand to hand. When I went to Alabama, I took a debate class. In that debate class, we played a game one week. And the game is get up there, and as long as you hold people's attention, you can continue to talk. And it became this game of who can last the longest talking, holding people's attention. And if you said or something like that, you took too long of a pause, you were out. We played this game. It was my turn. And I get up there and I'm like, okay, what am I going to tell? I knew stories were allowed. So I just told this story that Mr. Rusty told me when I was 15 years old about him and a snake and his buddy that got bit by that snake. I get up there and I tell that story. Do y'all think that was the same story that Mr. Rusty told me when I was 15? My granddaddy used to say, any story worth telling is a story worth embellishing. And, when I tell a story, and then Mr. Rusty told me when I was 15, I changed some things to make it work more for the context of the situation. I know for a fact that another student in there told the same story in another debate class in another semester. That story has now been passed down to other people we don't even know. Do y'all think it's going to be the same story that Mr. Rusty told me when he was 15, when I was 15? No, it's not the same story. Because things change. That's what humans do. We change stories. We make it our own. When we look at other documents, people changed them. They made it their own. They added things. But then all of a sudden, we've got these books that didn't change. They stand alone. And that's why I use the word here. Their preservation is unnaturally accurate. They shouldn't be that accurate. And so I think that comes to a conclusion. Either a divine being is preserving it, or humanity has accomplished its greatest feat by preserving the works over 3,500 years. You can make that decision for yourself. But this is, why we're talking about this. They are unnaturally accurate. Usually the reasons why we end up talking about this is because this is a powerful defense against skeptics, or like what I like to call internet warriors, where it seems like for some reason, 9 times out of 10, when I end up in conversations with people about Old Testament accuracy, maybe we do end up talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is always over the internet. There's a sermon in itself about having these conversations on the internet. The problem with having conversations on the internet is because internet is kind of an echo chamber. You hear whatever you want to hear. On these different pages like Reddit or some kind of forums like those, or even Facebook, any kind of social media, Google, if you Google things by doing research, you aren't going to find truth. You're going to find what those platforms think you want to listen to. And so what you end up doing is you end up finding groups and communities on the internet that already believe what you believe, and all those things do is give you assurances that you're right. Nobody challenges you. Well, every once in a while, you'll have someone come out of the woodwork on your echo chamber, and they'll have a different belief, and everybody blasts them. It's hard to get someone to sit down and have a reasonable conversation about the evidence that we have for the text. That's hard to do. But if you can get the opportunity to sit down and have a reasonable conversation about the text, this is a powerful defense to talk about that. But thinking along with that, many skeptical people of the Bible have never actually researched it. And that's the way internet works as well, right? You can post anything you want to without any source. As long as it's logical for that context, or that makes sense, it gets posted, it gets upvoted, and that's what people think is right. This is not an avenue to sit and actually have a reasonable conversation about the defenses that we have for the text that we believe in. Now, however, let's hit this very hard. Things like this, or things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, or whatever it may be, they are powerful defenses, but that is all they are. They are only defenses for our faith. They are shields. They are not swords. And sadly, when people want to talk to people about God, when they want to talk about skeptical people about God, all they end up doing is immediately jumping to a topic like this. But this topic is only a defense so us that already are believers can go, okay, well, I've heard these skeptical comments, but you know what? Those things aren't very well researched. It's not an attack. These things do not convince, convict, or persuade. And I say that because convincing, convicting, and persuading come only from what's in the books, not the books themselves, right? The conviction, the convicting, the persuading, they don't come from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't come from outside sources. They come from the gospel. It's the message of Jesus. You think about this famous passage in 2 Timothy 4:2. Preach the word, be ready in season and in out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. Does he tell Timothy what you need to do is find these out evidences of different texts and you go to those people and that's going to convict them? No, he says the gospel, the word, is what does the convincing, rebuking, exhorting. And that's the way it should be. That should be our attitude about it. This is an elder qualification in Titus 1. Paul told Titus, holding fast to the faithful words that he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict. Where does the exhorting and the persuading and the convicting come from? It comes from the gospel. And if we try to use these things as a sword and not a shield, we're not going to be very successful. But I do think every once in a while, it is a good reminder to go, okay, well, actually, this is a good shield. And there are powerful defenses out there to explain why this text is trustworthy. And I think that's something exciting and worth talking about. That's all that I have. That's like all I needed to handle, at least for that setting. Let me remind you one more time about what Moses said in Deuteronomy 30. He said, this is the commandment which I command you today, that it is not too mysterious for you, nor it is not too far off. He says, the word is near you. You don't have to ask someone to go get it for you. Someone already has come and given it to you. The gospel, the church, God, the things that we need to know to obey the gospel, the things we need to know to be his disciples are not too mysterious. They're not far away from us. They're actually readily available. And if that's something that you want to be a part of, and at least you understand enough to know that God is not far from us, why don't you let us assist you? If you will please come forward as we stand and sing.